Trade was once treated as a technical subject, but today it has become a political battlefield. In Europe, trade triggers real concerns. Agreements negotiated over years can collapse in a single political moment, not necessarily because the deal is bad, but because public trust is fragile. The benefits are hard to see, and the debate is too often shaped by fear, not facts. Europe cannot afford to get this wrong. In a world that is growing more fragmented by the day, trade is part of how Europe protects its interests and defends its way of life. It is also how Europe projects its values, builds influence without force, and creates partnerships without dependence. This podcast aims to bring that bigger picture closer, making trade easier to understand, easier to discuss, and ultimately easier to decide on together. Here we explore how Europe trades, why it matters, and how we can build a better public conversation around it. Welcome to Trade Matters. I'm Owen from the Wilfred Martin Centre. Today's episode starts with a question. Is the EU a trade superpower? We're delighted to be joined by three people who sit at different points on this debate. SABINE WEYAND, Director General for Trade and Economic Security at the European Commission, and two EPP MEPs from the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament, JÖRGEN WARBORN from Sweden and IULIU WINKLER from Romania. For those listeners like me who are not technical trade experts, I think it's important that I start by explaining that it's the European Commission that negotiates the trade agreements on behalf of the EU, and that those agreements then go before the European Parliament and national parliaments for final ratification. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. SABINE, let me start quickly with you. We didn't hear this phrase trade superpower a lot until relatively recently, but I think it does capture something about how the EU now is trying to use its economic power to shape partnerships and standards globally. Trade is a notable exception in that it's very much viewed as an EU competence. So I'm just wondering, in this very unsettled geopolitical environment, what exactly is the EU's trade offer to other countries at the moment? How are we defining ourselves in the current geopolitical context?
Now, Owen, I will start by disagreeing with your first question. That's always a good start into the discussion.
That is a very good start.
No, because I think we have always been a trade superpower, because this was one of the policies where the member states of the EU decided from the beginning that they should act as one. And that has made the strength of the EU in global trade. Now, you are right, though, that things have changed over the last few years, because before you could be a trade superpower and you were recognized as a heavyweight globally in general.
Indeed.
Today, you can no longer separate economic heft from political and military power. And I think that is the new element that we see. And that is, of course, an area. These are areas where the EU has a lot of catching up to do. We are investing in that. But at the same time, we need to benefit from the tools we have. And trade policy is the geopolitical and geoeconomic tool that the EU has at its disposal. And as the world becomes a more difficult place to navigate, we have increasing uncertainty being brought in by very volatile tariff policy by our main trading partner, the US. We have distortions coming from China's non-market policies and practices. The rest of the world is looking to the EU for stability, for predictability, and for fair win-win partnerships. And I think that is the offer that we can make. And that is more relevant than ever.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Jörgen, I'm going to come to you next because I know you have a very important meeting in the European Parliament, signing with President Metsola. But you're from Sweden, probably one of the most overtly pro-trade economies in the EU. So I'm just wondering, how can we sell a positive story on trade at a European level? Like, what is it in Sweden that underpins that level of public support and probably even more importantly, political support?
Taking it from the Swedish perspective, I mean, 150 years ago, Sweden was a very poor country. And then we started to liberalize the economy and facilitate for entrepreneurs to building their businesses. And slowly they grew. And then the Swedish market, it's not that huge, it became too small. So those investors, those entrepreneurs, those businesses started to trade elsewhere. And I think that reality is still there with 10 million consumers, with 10 citizens of 10 million. Companies like Volvo, like IKEA, like Spotify, they wouldn't be able to do their great services because you need a bigger market, basically. And that's also true for a lot of countries and a lot of companies in Europe. And when that happened, when trade grew, we saw that that was very beneficial for consumers. Because also when you open up for trade, it means that the consumers get more choices. They get better products offered to them, better quality or lower prices, or in some instances both. And that is also important. So it's driven from consumer and from businesses, and actually it took us out of poverty. Trade is an excellent way of bringing people out of poverty. We are pretty well off in Europe. Of course, we would like to increase our growth even further. But this is also an offer to our trading partners today. Trade with us, and your economy will grow as well. So there is a win-win situation, and we benefit, both of us. But there is another argument as well, and that is the argument regarding peace. Because when countries trade with each other, creating the dependency, that means that you hesitate into going into conflict. And I think that has of course been one of the core issues for forming the European Union, and one of the reasons we do free trade agreements and work together in a broader context, even in WTO, of course, because these trade dependencies, they are good. Nowadays, of course, with economic security, we see that in some cases we might have become too dependent on one singular economic power, and that's why we also need the diversification, and that's why we need to negotiate even more free trade agreements so that we get that diversification and get that possibility for businesses to source their products or sell their products in different kinds of markets.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a friend who's a stockbroker said to me that trade agreements should be like investing in the stock market. You want a diversified portfolio.
True, very true.
Notwithstanding how much you might love some of your traditional stocks or partners, which I think was an interesting way to think about it. So when you bring then that very pro-trade Swedish mindset to the European Parliament, do you find it kind of difficult to get that positive story out on the Parliament floor, even within the EPP? Because a lot of these things are domestically driven, politically driven, not necessarily about what's in clause 6A of whatever trade agreement. And I'm just wondering about that, like that real challenge on the Parliament floor.
Well, yes and no. In some cases and in some agreements, the Mercosur agreement is one of the good example of this. I think that, in a sense, the trade agreements get kidnapped, in a sense, in maybe what is other problems, because I have the most respect for farmers, and in some instances they have a really tough situation. But I would argue that the Mercosur agreement is not a reason for they to be very concerned. First of all, it's not for farmers as such.
Yeah.
There are some sensitive products when it comes to the Mercosur countries. But here I have to give credit to the Commission, because I think the Commission has catered for those sensitivities in a very good way. It might get a bit technical, but there are tariff rate quotas, meaning that a certain limited volume. There are some safeguards kicking in that the tariffs can come back from these countries if the market is changing dramatically, and there is even some insurance policy, as we call it, some money that can help the farmers. So I think that's an excellent example where a free trade agreement has been caught in the process where we need to give supports to farmers in certain instances. I mean, we have a regulatory burden that is too burdensome for a lot of businesses, not least the farmers. And this is a discussion, of course, of the MFF and the CAP. So, and trade gets entangled in all this. And I think, yes, it is complicated. And that's why you need to communicate these issues so much more and say all the benefits as well. Because in the debate, it's like the Mercosur agreement is only about farmers and farming products. No, it's not. It's a geopolitical deal that has to do with how we work together with or against, how you would like to put it, with China, because of course only a couple of years ago Europe were the biggest trader, was much bigger than China in the Mercosur countries. Now it's the reverse situation. With the Mercosur agreement, we can go back to become a bigger player than China, which I think would be a good thing. And when it comes to diversification, of course, it's really important, and all the opportunities there are for industrial goods. So yes, in summary, there are sensitivities for some farming products, but that has been catered for, and let's now move on with this agreement so that we can have the benefits of that one.
Yeah. IULIU, before I come back to you to talk more about the Parliament, Sabine, I was just wondering, are we kind of seeing a kind of new pragmatism now in the Commission about, because this is something we've been arguing for in the Martin Centre for a long time, is that, look, in a perfect world, sure, we could have these all-encompassing free trade agreements that would cover every sector, and our trading partners would gladly accept all our standards, including our environmental standards. But I think maybe because of the geopolitics and because of what's happened, maybe that India is a really positive first step. Because if you were to ask me 6 months ago, I would say India will take another decade. And yet, here we are. Agriculture has been excluded, not just, I presume, from because of a European wish, but also maybe from India is a very complicated economy. So are we seeing kind of a new dawn in DG Trade?
Well, you will not be surprised to hear me say that in the Commission, in DG Trade, we have always said there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach to FTAs, to free trade agreements. But I agree with your observation. I think in the past, we also used to deal with smaller and more like-minded countries. Now we are dealing with a generation of emerged economies, which are, quite confident of their own power. They know that they are the centers of growth. That applies to the countries of Mercosur, to Brazil and Argentina. That applies to India, to Indonesia. I mean, these are self-confident countries, and they know that they have demography and growth on their side. So that creates a different negotiating situation. And we have always said we need to tailor the agreements to the interests of the EU vis-à-vis a given country or entity, and we also need to respect the interests of our trading partner, because you only get an agreement if both sides see a win in that. Otherwise, you just don't have an agreement. What I would call this is perhaps principled pragmatism, and India is actually a good example of that. Because we engaged with them, we always said we need to have a commercially meaningful agreement. There were sensitivities on both sides, but we also had to cater for the offensive interests of both sides. And that is a matter of give and take. That was more complicated perhaps with a country like India, which represents 1.5 billion people and negotiates on behalf of 1.5 billion people, and they know it, than it is with smaller countries with more similar structures as well. But at the same time, I think we knew that this is not just what we trade, but it is also about how we trade. Yes. And this is not about imposing our standards on another country. What we are doing is basically saying we build our strengthened partnership on a common floor of international agreements on labor rights and on environmental protection and climate protection. So we build these agreements, these trade agreements, on a shared commitment to the Paris Agreement, to the ILO. The way you express that, there you have to be flexible and react to what works for the partner. And that is why an agreement with India could never look like an agreement with New Zealand, does not look like an agreement with Indonesia. And I think that is what I call principled pragmatism. We do not give up our values. We know what we stand for. We have honest conversations, but then we tailor the agreement so that it works for both sides.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. IULIU, if I could come to you, you're in the European Parliament. I have to confess that about 10, 11 years ago, I was in Bucharest. I was at a public event. I was trying my very, very best to defend what was then the proposed transatlantic trade investment partnership between Europe and the US. And for want of a better word, the event was just completely hijacked by a very organised campaign focused on one issue, which was food safety. So I'm just wondering, when these trade deals, they come to you in the European Parliament, how do you kind of combat that kind of, I call it kind of instinctive negativity, because trade has become a kind of issue where it just crystallises grievances, domestic often grievances that have absolutely nothing to do with trade. Economic insecurity, farmers, etc., etc. So I was just wondering, how do you deal with that, or do we have any better tools than we did 10 years ago?
Well, your question is the topic of a nice conference of one day, 4 panels, bringing in, trade experts, politicians, communication experts, because it is about communication, and I think it is about framing. And it is very interesting that you went back to this TTIP discussion, because also I myself, I'm going back very often to those times. Not that I would have loved TTIP. Really, I would have loved the transatlantic agreement, and probably, I don't know, today we would have been in a different place that we really are if we have had 10 years of common exercise of transatlantic rule-based engagement. But we don't have it. But at that time, in 2013, 2014, if I remember correctly, in the 2014 European elections, the TTIP was the issue in Germany and France. And it was, I think, a minimal issue in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, or Hungary in the eastern part of Europe, because nobody was watching that. And then I also remember, also in the same times, I remember it was Pascal Lamy, the former Trade Commissioner and WTO Director General, in some conference in the European Parliament in that period, 2011 or something like this, he said that we are watching the birth of a new world of trade. Because trade before, and those are his words, trade before was an in-camera business. And it was going to become an in-agora business, because trade really was the job of the negotiators. Politicians said, come on, you should do something, and then negotiators did the deed without so much public. Probably it was an academy interest. But it was really zero public interest 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I hope I'm not, I'm remembering it correctly. And now, as you say, this framing of the discussion, because what Sabine, you said, it's a principled pragmatism. I think from the Parliament point of view, it comes to the following. The European Union has values and has interests. And so if we have both, then we have to follow our interest, because that is about European institutions. We have to follow the European Union interest, but we have always to be within the boundary created by our values. But then it is much more our problem in the European Parliament that we have to keep on the discussion with the public, because it's us who have to get voted. This is a problem for the European Parliament. It's not really for the DG Trade or any part of the Commission. So that then we have the following difficulty, which is increasing as social media becomes more penetrant, as everybody lives and takes his or her information from various social media, in which you have to express yourself in 200 characters or in one picture or whatever, 15 seconds or what the attention span is. And the problem of trade as a technicality is that it cannot be expressed by a picture. No. It cannot be expressed by the 15 seconds or by the 200 characters. And I always say, there is the saying that a picture is more than 1,000 words. And I love working with youngsters. And I always say to the youngsters, look, this is true, but only if you, in your lifespan, you have read the 1,000 words. Then you can understand one picture. If not, then the picture remains lost cause, because you cannot enter the technicalities of tariff rate quotas, of, I don't know, may I give an example for my country?
Yeah.
The first trading partner inside the European Union of Romania, my country, is Germany. The second one is Italy. So going back to Mercosur, because Jörgen also discussed Mercosur, and I make the following case. The German economy, the German industry, first of all, is to gain a lot from the Mercosur agreement. Yeah. The same is for Italy. So if my country's first and second trading partner inside the European Union is Germany and Italy, if the Romanian companies, it is thousands of them, tens of thousands or 250,000 jobs in Romania are linked to German companies, and the work created, the jobs created by the German companies in Romania. So if German business goes better, then those supply chains are working better, those jobs are even more necessary, and this is the indirect gain of Romania from the Mercosur agreement, which is not an agricultural agreement. But then you meet the fantastic mobilization power of the agricultural associations, of those associations also in Romania and other countries, which are parts of the European associations. Let us don't name them.
Yes.
Or we can name them, of course. And then you see a very simple declaration about Mercosur destroys our agriculture. Mercosur will fill us with GMOs, with all the chlorine chicken and genetically modified beef and whatever, and this fits in the 15 seconds. But our complicated and technical trade explanation does not fit the 50 seconds. So this is the problem that we discuss in International Trade Committee also, how to communicate convincingly about really the advantages of trade, the jobs created by trade. In my country also, Jörgen said Sweden was a poor country 100 years ago. I would argue that in some regions, Romania is even a poor country today. Yeah. So we have a lot of things to do. Yeah. And trade is a tool. Trade is good for us.
Yeah. It's almost like it's become, as Sabine mentioned earlier, it's almost less about the detail now and more about the value and what you believe. Like, we believe in democracy, but we believe in, we say, free and fair trade that enriches us all. And just to let the listeners know, we will have future episodes both on the specific issue of agriculture and on the issue of political communication, drawing on some past experience. Sabine, just building on what IULIU was saying, I was just wondering, there's the movie that's probably going to win a lot of Oscars with Leonardo DiCaprio, called One Battle After Another. And sometimes I feel that here in Brussels, particularly the EU institutions, that we're continuously having one battle after another on trade. Have we kind of been focused on the wrong battle, and should we kind of take a different line, which is to say that yes, we believe in trade. It's one of our principles. There's going to be like X, Y, Z benefits, but we also need maybe to be a little bit more honest about if there are going to be trade-offs.
Look, I would say, and then this goes back to the question we just discussed about communication.
Yeah.
I think communicating trade has become more difficult in the age of social media.
Yeah.
And in the age of political entrepreneurs who make their livelihood out of sending partial messages or sometimes clearly crossing over into disinformation.
Yeah.
But that is their raison d'etre. It's very difficult to fight against that.
Yeah.
So that has been amplified. We've tried that, and if we go back to the TTIP story, we learned a lot because at that time, negotiations were indeed a closed shop. You know, and nobody had showed any interest in these negotiations before.
Yeah.
In the course of TTIP, we became a lot more transparent as a
Yes.
negotiator. So we shared the text. We were very transparent with the parliament and the member states, but also with the public. But information alone is not communication. And I think that is what we are learning now.
Very true.
Now, I'm a little bit sad to hear what you say about how we communicated Mercosur, because I think we have always been clear. We've put the figures on the table of what are the benefits of this agreement.
Yeah.
We have also explained that, of course, the EU is the world's largest agricultural, agri-food exporter. We benefit massively from this agreement. We have recognized that there are defensive sectors which we want to protect against too much competition. And that is why we only let a limited quantity of these sensitive goods into the EU. Essentially, for Mercosur, it's beef.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we said, if you still think there is a problem, so we have recognized that there is something that needs to be protected.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you still think there's a problem, there are also safeguard measures. So we have been trying to address the factual background to the concerns that we have. But we also have to recognize that there are people, political entrepreneurs, who make their career of amplifying grievances. And I've had private conversations with people who say, we know that Mercosur is not a problem for us, but it has helped us mobilize our constituencies.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think this is a political reality which is very difficult to deal with. We haven't found the answer to that. But I think the main thing is to have transparency.
Yeah.
And to basically make sure that it is not that the Commission as a negotiator that carries the task of communication on its own.
Correct.
Because we are always going to defend what we have negotiated. So I think we need to have parliamentarians, we need to have politicians at national level that communicate about that.
Yes.
And here I think the geopolitical context helps, because previously people said, these agreements will go through. I don't need to do anything. I want them to happen. Yes. I don't need to mobilize for it to happen, because it will work without me spending political capital on it.
Correct.
That is no longer the case. And now, the status quo is not good enough. We need more agreements.
Yeah.
So the proponents of the agreements are also becoming more outspoken on the politician side as well as on the business side.
Yeah.
Where I'm still waiting for this to happen is on the export-oriented agricultural sectors.
Yes.
And there are many of those.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think they still think, well, the agreement is going to happen. I will be able to reap the benefits without having to expose myself with my colleagues who are in more sensitive sectors.
Yeah. I don't want to have a big debate on agriculture, but personally, I feel, Mercosur was just kind of a tipping point that reflected a lot of worries in rural Europe that go back to the 1980s.
That's a very important point you're making, because I think you always have to see what is the basis and substance behind any grievances.
Yeah.
Even if you think they may be misrepresented or blown out of proportion, there is always some grain of a real concern behind it.
Yes. And
you need to show that you have the means of addressing the real concern behind it.
Exactly.
And that is what Jörgen also said, what we've done with Mercosur.
Yeah.
With different layers, as I said, the quantitative restrictions on imports, plus the safeguard clause, which allows us to reinstate tariffs if there is a problem for the EU the EU economy in this respect, and also financial support for farmers.
Yeah.
But we also have to recognize that there are lots of concerns of the farming community which have nothing to do with trade, but which are amplified by trade, or where people now, on top of everything else, we also have competition from outside. And that is what we need to address, but we need to go back to what are the real concerns. And that is what we need to do in the next financial framework for the EU. That's what we need to do in terms of reducing red tape for farmers that is there through regulation. So, I mean, this is a multi-pronged approach that we have to take.
Yeah, I agree. And people often forget that, much like in many other sectors of the European economy, agriculture is a really ageing sector really, really quickly. And things like tax rates on land transfer, inheritance taxes are incredibly important for if we want to keep young European farmers in the game. IULIU, Sabine mentioned political leadership. Do you think now that with events on the other side of the Atlantic and the general environment, and also I guess it'll be 10 years in June since the Brexit referendum, we can look back and say, okay, sometimes I feel commentators in Brussels paint the UK like it's Zimbabwe. You know, it's not. But, you know, it's growing slower. Maybe it hasn't grown as fast because of the trade barriers that have gone up. So I'm just wondering, are you detecting any kind of willingness for those that are free trade to kind of stand up more and be political drivers of this?
Oh, that is an old saying, I don't know to whom it is attributed, that maybe even the most illuminated politicians who know exactly what they have to do, what they do not know is how to win elections after they did the correct thing.
Exactly.
So this is a problem, and this is the reason that I say it's not about politicians who are willing to take responsibility. This is a sort of whole of European institutions project.
Okay.
I mean, probably if we go to the Commission, then we have, grievances about political operators which are always on the dark side. And they are successful. And political operators being forces for the good are too few of them. But then if you listen to, if I can share with you some of my personal grievances, which I do share in every meeting that I have with business operators, European business, for the last 15 years. And I tell them, look, the people who are opposing trade, that are opponents of globalization, which of course probably are also opponents of our transatlantic partner, which are also opponents of trade and so on and so on. And they are doing community work for the last 2, maybe 2.5 decades, maybe 3 decades. They are present in the kindergartens, they are present in the schools, they are present in the universities with their views.
Yeah.
Which they are perfectly entitled to, because of course we live in a democracy and the democracy is important for all of us. But on the other side, on the side of business, on the side of competitiveness, on the side of jobs, on the side of real politics, there is not enough operators. There are not enough operators, and business has to be one of such kind of operator. It's not enough. Of course, they have been, they have been pushed towards all sorts of glass ceiling breaking and all sorts of corporate sustainable due diligence, blah, 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 blah. Too much of it, too much of it. But the most important responsibility they have, I think, is to explain society, to explain young people how a job is born.
Yes.
How you create a job, how you create economic growth. Of course, it has to be sustainable growth. Of course, it has to respect our values.
Yes.
But if trade is an instrument, if trade is a vehicle, and it is really the geopolitical vehicle of the European Union, but if you want to load everything on trade,
yes,
all the problems of the world, all the problems of the conflict in various regions, all the problems of the climate, all the problems of sustainability, then that vehicle will crumble.
Yeah.
And we will see that we will not find any more like-minded partners, and we will meet people across the globe, in the global south, first of all, who say, look, my friends, we are tired of you preaching to us. And this is a reality that we have to consider, and we have to find some solutions for this type of reality also. And just finally, to make a remark about because, discussion of farming, it is so important in the context of trade also, but it's also important in a different context, which I would say the European way of life context. Because I don't know if in this commission we have a commissioner for European way of life. I don't know, but we had a commissioner for the European way of life in von der Leyen first commission. And this is very important. This is also why you are compelled to disclose in a discussion like this that your background's coming from the rural Ireland. I would disclose something, or Sabine would disclose something like this linked to the European way of life, which for some might be the urban dwellers, but for many others it would be the rural background. And of course, we have the problem with politicians in the European Parliament, the happiness, of course, that those are our constituents. They vote for us.
Perfect. Well, look, I really enjoyed the discussion today. We could talk pretty much for hours about agriculture alone or Mercosur. So I'll just close by saying, is the EU a trade superpower? Well, I think what we've heard today is that the answer is complicated, but that there is a space for principled pragmatism based on fair, predictable and win-win trade. I think that is an agreement. That is kind of a description we can agree on. But I think the tensions we've explored today aren't going away. Trade will remain politically contested. The gap between Brussels negotiations and public anxiety will persist. But as Sabine, JÖRGEN and IULIU have made clear, the stakes are too high to get this wrong. In a fragmenting world, trade is now very much part of how Europe defends its interests and builds influence. The question is whether we can make the case for it honestly, without arrogance, and in ways that actually resonate with ordinary people's lives. Finally, I just want to thank Sabine, JÖRGEN and IULIU for the conversation today. Next episode, we're tackling the communication problem head on. See you next time on Trade Matters.